She was on her knees in the gravel, hands zip-tied behind her back, blood running down her chin from where his knuckles had caught her cheekbone. The red and blue light strobed across the parking lot of Pine Valley Medical Center like something out of a nightmare. Officer Dale Pruitt stood over her with his chest puffed out and his hand already reaching for the taser, and he was smiling. He actually smiled. "People like you," he said, loud enough for the other deputies to hear, "need to learn what respect looks like." Rachel Foster looked up at him through the blood and the flashing lights, and her voice came out flat and quiet and completely controlled. "Officer, don't make this worse." He didn't listen. Nobody ever does. And that was the mistake that ended everything. If this story already has you holding your breath, follow me right now so you don't miss a single part. Hit that like button, drop your city in the comments below, because I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Let's go. Rachel Foster had been awake for 19 hours when the lights appeared in her rearview mirror. It was 6:14 in the morning. The sky over Cedar Ridge, Wyoming was still that dark blue-gray color that comes just before sunrise decides to commit, and the road out of Pine Valley Medical Center's staff parking lot was empty except for her 10-year-old Civic and the cruiser that had been following her for the last 4 blocks. She noticed it 2 turns back but didn't speed up. She didn't slow down either. She just drove the way she always drove. Both hands on the wheel, eyes moving, breathing steady. She was 31 hours off a double shift, technically. She'd stayed 2 hours past the end of her overnight to help cover a trauma bay that was understaffed again. 3 incoming from a highway pileup on Route 18. One of them a 16-year-old with a punctured lung and the kind of fear in his eyes that you can't describe to someone who hasn't seen it. She'd stayed because she always stayed when it mattered. That was the thing about Rachel that her coworkers understood and her supervisors largely ignored. She didn't have an off switch. The lights came on at the corner of Birch and Mallow, half a mile from her apartment. She pulled over cleanly, cut the engine, put her registration and license on the dash before he'd even stepped out of the cruiser. 19 hours of hospital work had left her wearing dark blue scrubs with a bleach stain on the left knee and dried coffee on her sleeve. Her dark hair was coming loose from the braid she'd done at the start of her shift. She looked exactly like what she was, a tired nurse going home. Officer Dale Pruitt took his time getting out of the car. She watched him in the side mirror. Big guy, mid-30s, the kind of build that came from lifting weights in a gym rather than doing actual physical work. He had his hand resting on his belt when he came around to her window, and he hadn't turned on his body camera. She noticed that too. License and registration. She handed them through the window without a word. He looked at them for longer than he needed to. Then he looked at her. "You were driving erratically back there." "I wasn't," she said, not argumentatively, just as a statement of fact. His jaw moved. "Are you calling me a liar?" "I'm telling you what I was doing. I kept to the speed limit and made 2 legal turns. If you have a concern about my driving, I'm happy to hear it." Something shifted in his face. It wasn't anger yet exactly. It was something before anger. The look of a person who isn't used to people not flinching. "Step out of the vehicle." "Can I ask why?" "I said step out." She stepped out. She moved slowly and kept her hands visible, which was a habit from a different part of her life that she rarely thought about anymore but never actually forgot. She stood beside the car with her arms at her sides and her eyes straight ahead. "Hands on the hood." She complied. He patted her down roughly, more roughly than was necessary, and then his hand closed around her upper arm and he spun her to face him. Up close he smelled like cigarettes and something chemical and sour. "You got an attitude problem, you know that?" "I answered your questions," she said. "You got an attitude problem," he repeated like she hadn't spoken. "I see it all the time with people like you. Think the rules don't apply." She didn't answer that. "What were you doing at the hospital at this hour?" "I work there. I'm a nurse in the emergency department." He looked her up and down in a way that was meant to make her feel small. "Sure you are." "My hospital ID is in my left breast pocket if you'd like to verify that." He didn't look at it. He pulled out a zip tie instead, and that was when she knew this wasn't a traffic stop. This had been a traffic stop the way a fishing line is a piece of string. Technically true, not the point. "Turn around." "Officer, I need you to tell me what I'm being detained for." He grabbed her by the shoulder and shoved her toward the hood of her car. Hard enough that her cheekbone caught the metal edge of the mirror housing on the way down, and she tasted blood immediately. The gravel rushed up and she hit it with both knees. He had her hands zip-tied behind her back before she could fully process what had happened. And then he was standing over her with the taser out, and he said it. The thing that she would hear again and again in the weeks that followed, in the dark, in the way that moments like that have of burning themselves into the surface of your memory. People like you need to learn what respect looks like. Rachel looked up at him. Her cheek was bleeding, her knees were torn, she was exhausted and hurting, and the lights were strobing, and there were two other deputies standing back by the cruiser watching this happen. She said very quietly, "Officer, don't make this worse." He smiled, and he reached for the taser. What happened next lasted maybe 4 seconds. It wasn't a fight. A fight implies two people trying to hurt each other. What it was a correction. A single precise movement executed by someone whose body still remembered 8 years of training the way a musician's hands remember a piece they haven't played in a long time. Automatically, without thought, cleanly. She didn't break his arm. She could have. She chose not to. She did put him on the ground. When it was over, Pruitt was on his back in the gravel with his taser 6 feet away from him, and his expression carrying the specific look of a man who has just discovered that the world contains a category of person he had not previously accounted for. Rachel was on her feet, zip ties broken. Her hands had found the right angle, and she was standing completely still with her arms at her sides again. "I told you," she said, "not to make this worse." The two deputies by the cruiser had drawn their weapons. She raised her hands immediately. She knew how this went. She had always known it would get worse before the truth had a chance to catch up. Bassam. Cedar Ridge was a small city, the way places at the edge of mountains are sometimes small. Contained, insular. The kind of place where the same families had been running things for 2 or 3 generations, and nobody found that strange. The police department operated under Captain Roland Hicks, who had held that position for 11 years and who was, by every official measure, a respected pillar of the community. He coached youth football. He attended every ribbon cutting. He shook hands with the mayor at public events, and the mayor shook back like they were equals and not, as was actually the case, two people who owed each other specific things. Rachel didn't know any of this yet. What she knew, sitting in a holding cell at the Cedar Ridge Police Department at 7:30 in the morning, was that her knees were bleeding through her scrub pants and that no one had offered her medical attention, and that the charge sheet listed assault on a law enforcement officer as the primary count. Her coworker, Jamie Reeves, was the first one to call her. She heard the phone ringing from the property bag they'd taken and not given back to her. She asked the duty officer to let her make a call. He told her to wait. She waited 2 hours. When they finally let her use the phone, she called a lawyer named Perry Grau, who'd been recommended to her by one of the ER docs 3 months ago when she'd had a landlord dispute. He was not a criminal defense attorney. He showed up anyway, which she gave him credit for. He sat across from her in the consultation room and looked at the paperwork, and then he looked at her cheek, which had swollen to twice its normal size, and then he looked at the paperwork again. "Rachel," he said carefully, "this is a bad situation. I know what the situation is. They have 3 officers who are going to testify that you initiated physical contact. Pruitt shoved me into the side mirror of my own car. I have a laceration on my cheekbone. They say you fell." She looked at him. "He zip-tied me. There's gravel in my knees." Perry took his glasses off and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Look, I'm being straight with you because that's the only way I know how to work. A jury in this county, looking at your word against 3 uniformed officers, that's a very difficult case to make." "What are you telling me?" "I'm telling you the smart move, legally, practically, is to consider a plea. Something minor, disorderly conduct. You pay a fine, we get the assault charge dropped, you keep your nursing license, and you move on." The room was very quiet. "Just plead guilty," he said, softer, like softening it would change what it was. Rachel sat with that for a moment. She thought about what she'd survived before Cedar Ridge, before Pine Valley Medical Center, before Wyoming. She thought about a particular afternoon in a particular place she wasn't allowed to discuss in detail, where someone had told her that the smartest move was to pull back, and she had pulled back, and someone else had died because of it. She didn't think about that often. She was thinking about it now. "I didn't survive combat," she said, "to surrender to corruption." Perry put his glasses back on. He didn't say anything for a while, then, Okay, then we fight it. But Rachel, I need you to understand, this is going to be a hard road. I know about hard roads. She was arraigned at 10 that morning. She was released on her own recognizance, which surprised her. She walked out of this courthouse into a cold Wyoming morning with the paperwork in her hand and her hospital badge still in her pocket, and she stood on the courthouse steps for a moment, breathing. Her phone had 37 missed calls. Her supervisor at Pine Valley, a woman named Director Marcia Dunlop, had left 3 of them. The last one had come in at 9:45. The voicemail was 12 seconds long, and Marcia's voice sounded careful and clipped in a way that Rachel had never heard before. Rachel, this is Marcia. Please call me back. There are some things we need to discuss about your employment status. She was let go on a Wednesday. The official language was administrative leave pending investigation, which Pine Valley Medical Center's HR department explained meant she could not report to the hospital, could not access patient records, and could not represent herself as a Pine Valley employee in any capacity until further review. The review, they said, could take weeks or longer. Her supervisor couldn't meet her eyes during the Zoom call. Marcia, Rachel said, I've worked here for 3 years. You know me? Rachel, I need you to understand this is a process. A process, she repeated. A pause. Then, quietly, like Marcia was saying something she wasn't supposed to say. There were calls, Rachel. People above my level. I'm not in a position to... A longer pause. Just hold tight, please. The call ended. She sat in her apartment with the paperwork spread across the kitchen table and her cold coffee going colder, and she tried to build a clear picture of what she was dealing with. 3 officers. A captain who had already given a press statement that she'd heard on the radio driving home from the courthouse, describing a dangerous altercation in which a woman had ambushed Officer Pruitt on a routine traffic stop. The word ambushed used about a 135-pound nurse in hospital scrubs coming off a double shift. She thought, they've done this before. She knew what she knew about herself, about her record, about the specific 8 years she'd spent before nursing school. She also knew that knowledge about yourself means very little when the people constructing the narrative against you control the paperwork. She had learned that in a different context. She was relearning it now. 2 days after her termination, a deputy she'd never seen before drove slowly past her apartment building 3 times in 4 hours. She noted the plate, the times, the specific route. She still had her notebook habits from before. She wrote everything down. On the 5th day, Jamie Reeves showed up at her door with 2 coffees and a look on her face like she was trying to figure out how to say something. Just say it, Rachel told her. People at the hospital are talking, Jamie said, about the arrest, about what Pruitt's people are saying happened. What are they saying? That you went after him, unprovoked, that you had some kind of breakdown. Jamie looked at her. Nobody who knows you believes it. How many people who know me are saying it out loud? Jamie didn't answer, which was its own answer. Someone went through your personnel file, Jamie added. Marcia didn't authorize it. We don't know who did. Rachel drank her coffee. Was anything pulled? Your emergency contact form and your pre-employment background check documentation. She thought about what was in a pre-employment background check for someone who had spent 8 years in a role that wasn't described in any of the standard employment categories. There were gaps in the official record, not because she was hiding anything, but because certain things weren't documented in the places civilian HR systems looked. Okay, she said. Okay? Jamie stared at her. Rachel, somebody's trying to build a case against you before you even get to trial. They're going through your private records. I know. Does that not scare you? Rachel looked out the window at the parking lot, empty. She thought about what it meant that they'd pulled her pre-employment records. She thought about what it meant that they'd looked in a place where they expected to find something damaging and had almost certainly found something they didn't expect. Not particularly, she said. No, again. The call came on the 9th day. She almost didn't answer it. The number was a 571 area code, which she knew was Northern Virginia, and she sat looking at it ring for 3 full cycles before she picked up. Ms. Foster. Not a question. A man's voice, measured and professional. Speaking. My name is Major Ethan Brooks. I'm with the Army Criminal Investigation Command out of Quantico. I'd like to talk to you about some information we've recently come across regarding your case. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a car drove past. I'm listening, she said. We've been reviewing the incident reports from the Cedar Ridge PD regarding your arrest, he said. We've noticed some significant inconsistencies between the reports filed by the 3 officers present, between the officers' accounts and the physical evidence, and between the department's official version of events and certain records that have come to our attention through other channels. Other channels, she repeated. Ms. Foster. A pause. A measured one. Your service record was accessed as part of what we understand was the department's background research on you. That access triggered an automatic flag. Part of your record falls under a classification level that civilian law enforcement does not have authorization to request or view. Another pause. That's a federal matter, separate from whatever is happening with your criminal charges. But in the course of addressing that federal matter, we've taken a closer look at the circumstances of your case. She let that settle. And, she said, and we'd like to sit down with you, in person, if you're willing. She looked at the notebook on her kitchen table. 9 days of documentation, times, plates, routes, names. Everything she'd seen and heard since the morning Pruitt had pulled her over. I'm willing, she said. Good. Something in his voice shifted slightly. Still professional, but with something underneath it. Not warmth exactly. Recognition. Ms. Foster, I want to say one more thing before we meet. What I've read about your record, the full record, not the civilian version, I want you to know that this office takes very seriously what's been done to you. Whatever else comes from this, that's not going to be ignored. She didn't thank him. She just said, when and where. Major Ethan Brooks was not what she'd expected, which probably meant she'd been expecting a type. He was lean, late 40s, with the kind of face that had been weathered in a specific way that Rachel recognized from people who had spent a lot of time in places where the weather was the least of your problems. He wore civilian clothes to the meeting, a diner 12 miles outside Cedar Ridge chosen by him, but he carried himself in uniform even without one. He had 2 people with him, a woman named Special Agent Carla Voss from the federal side of things, who had an extremely calm demeanor and a specific kind of intelligence in her eyes that Rachel noticed immediately, and a younger male investigator whose name she didn't catch and who mostly took notes. Brooks slid a folder across the table toward her. She opened it. The first page was a side-by-side comparison of 3 incident reports filed by Pruitt and the 2 deputies who'd been present. The same event, 3 accounts. They contradicted each other on timeline, on physical positioning, on the sequence of events during what they were calling the altercation. Not subtle contradictions, the kind that come from people who know the conclusion they're writing toward and aren't careful enough about the details. The second page was a forensic analysis of the body camera footage. Specifically, the timestamp on Pruitt's camera showed it had been powered on at 6:09 a.m., before the stop, and then powered off remotely at 6:13 a.m., 1 minute before she pulled over. The camera was off before he approached her car. That's not an accident, she said. No, Brooks said. It's not. The third page was the part that made her go still. It was a list of names, 12 of them. Women and men with dates next to their names spanning the last 4 years, and next to each date, a charge, disorderly conduct, resisting arrest, assault on an officer. Some with case notes, some with outcomes. Most of the outcomes were guilty pleas, small ones, fines, community service, the kind of thing people took because fighting was too expensive and the system too tilted and they had jobs and families and couldn't risk going to trial. She looked up at Brooks. All Pruitt? She asked. 11 of the 12, yes. 1 was a different officer in the same department. And none of them went to trial. None. He held her gaze. Until now. Rachel sat with that. 12 people. 12 cases. Whatever he'd done to her in that parking lot, whatever this past 9 days had cost her in job and reputation and sleep, he had done it before, refined it, gotten good at it. The Army's involvement, she said. What's the scope? Brooks and Voss exchanged a brief look. We're coordinating with federal investigators, Voss said. This has moved beyond a complaint about a single officer. The captain, Rachel said. Hicks. Another exchanged look, this one slightly longer. Roland Hicks has been in contact with an individual named Warren Price, Voss said carefully. Price is a Cedar Ridge businessman with certain interests in how the local law enforcement environment operates. We are still building the scope of that relationship, but it is part of our investigation. Rachel looked at the list of 12 names again. What do you need from me? She asked. Your testimony, Brooks said. Official deposition, and there's a hearing scheduled, county level, regarding your criminal charges. We want to be present, with everything we have. Okay. Ms. Foster. He paused. I want to be clear about something. This process is going to escalate. When they realize the federal investigation has moved to this level, Pruitt and the others are going to push back. Hard. We believe they may attempt to interfere with witnesses, including you. You think they'll come after me? I think you should be prepared for that possibility. Rachel closed the folder and pushed it back across the table to him. She picked up her coffee, which had gone cold while they talked. Major, she said, I spent 8 years in roles that required me to function under sustained threat in environments significantly more hostile than Cedar Ridge, Wyoming. She drank the cold coffee. I appreciate the warning. I'm not worried about Dale Pruitt. Brooks looked at her for a moment, and there was something in his expression that was specific to people who'd read her full record and were now seeing it in context for the first time. No, he said. I don't suppose you are. 3 days later, they came for her in the parking garage of the county courthouse. She'd been scheduled for a deposition with Perry Grau, a preliminary thing, documentation. It was 9 a.m. The garage was partially occupied, but not crowded. She was on the 3rd level, walking toward the elevator when she heard the footsteps, multiple sets coming from her left and her right simultaneously. She didn't run. She assessed. Pruitt. 2 of the deputies from the night of her arrest, and 1 more she didn't recognize. 4 of them, spread out in a loose semicircle that was designed to funnel her toward the concrete pillar behind her. Testimony's a serious thing, Pruitt said. He'd left his uniform at home. He was in jeans and a jacket, and he was smiling again. People make mistakes in testimony all the time, sign papers saying things happened a certain way, and then later realize they misremembered. I have a very good memory, she said. People also get hurt in parking garages. Slip and fall. Terrible accidents. She did the math. 4 trained men in a confined space, motivated, coordinated. She was not carrying anything. She had a brace on her left knee from the damage done to it in the original arrest that slowed her lateral movement by roughly 15%. She kept her hands relaxed at her sides, and she watched all 4 of them at once, and she breathed slowly, and she waited, because waiting was sometimes the strategic option. The deputy on her left moved first. The next 40 seconds were not clean. That was the honest thing to say about it. She took a hit to the ribs that would turn into a bad bruise. She took another one across the shoulder that knocked her sideways into the pillar, and she used the pillar and she kept going. She put Pruitt down first because Pruitt was the one smiling, which experience had taught her meant he was the most dangerous. Not the biggest threat tactically, but the most committed to the outcome. Without Pruitt upright, the others would lose their confidence faster. She was right. When the elevator doors opened and 2 men in civilian clothes and 1 woman stepped out, what they found was Rachel Foster, bleeding from her lip and holding her ribs with 1 arm, standing over 3 men on the ground. The 4th, the one she didn't recognize, had run. Major Brooks did not say anything immediately. He looked at the scene. He looked at her. Then he reached for his radio. Special Agent Voss was already on her phone, and Rachel could hear her saying the words, "secure the exits," with the calm emphasis of someone who'd practiced saying that sentence. Brooks walked over to her. He was holding a trauma kit. She hadn't even noticed. "Let me look at that," he said, meaning her face. "It's fine. Sit down, Sergeant." She sat down. Nobody had called her that in 4 years. She hadn't expected it to hit differently than anything else, but it did. A little. Just a little. He cleaned the cut on her lip while, around them, federal agents moved through the parking garage and voices crackled on radios, and somewhere below she could hear the sound of police sirens. Different police, federal ones, converging on the building. "There's a camera," she said while he worked. "On every level," he confirmed. "We had eyes on the garage." She looked at him. You knew they might try this, she said. We considered it a realistic possibility. And you let me walk in anyway. He paused, tape in hand. We had 6 agents in position, and we weren't expecting them to move this fast or this openly. That's on us, I'm sorry. She evaluated whether she was angry and found she mostly wasn't. She was tired. She was hurting. She was thinking about a list of 12 names on a piece of paper and what it meant that a man like Pruitt had been doing this for 4 years in broad daylight, in a small city where everyone knew everyone, and nobody had stopped him. Brooks, she said. Yeah. The camera footage from this garage. Make sure it doesn't disappear. He finished the tape and sat back. It's already secured. She nodded. Below them, the sound of the sirens had stopped, which meant they'd arrived. She could hear shouting now. 2 of the deputies being walked through the garage, voices raised and then getting quieter, the way voices do when they realize the situation isn't what they thought it was. She heard Pruitt say loudly, "This is a setup." And then she heard nothing more from Pruitt, because someone had apparently decided he was done talking for the moment. Rachel sat on the concrete floor of the parking garage with her back against the pillar and her hand pressed to her ribs, and the federal investigation happening in real time around her, and she thought about the moment this had all started. A cold morning, empty road, a set of lights appearing in a rearview mirror. She hadn't done anything wrong that morning. She had driven correctly and spoken carefully and complied where it was reasonable to comply, and she had been hurt anyway, because some people don't need a reason. But the camera had been turned off before he even approached her car, which meant he'd known, going in, that what he was planning required no witnesses, which meant someone had told him to do it. She looked up at Brooks, who was watching her with the careful attention of someone who'd been trained to read people and knew he was looking at something complicated. "Price," she said. "The businessman." He didn't answer immediately. "Voss is pulling his financial records right now," he said finally. "What connection does he have to me? Why would he want Pruitt to come after me specifically?" Another pause. "One of the 3 trauma patients you treated the night before your arrest. The 16-year-old from the highway accident." He watched her face. "His name is Marcus Price, Warren Price's son." Rachel went very still. She thought back to that night. The highway pileup, 3 incoming, the boy with the punctured lung and the fear in his eyes. What she'd documented in his chart during treatment, what she'd been required by law to document when she saw the pattern of injuries that didn't match the story of a simple car accident, what she'd reported to the attending physician, what had been forwarded, per protocol, to the appropriate county office, the bruising that wasn't from the crash. "Oh," she said quietly. "Yeah," Brooks said. "Oh." The sound of boots on concrete as more agents moved through the levels above them. Somewhere a door slammed. The parking garage smelled like exhaust and cold concrete, and somewhere, distantly, coffee from a vendor cart at the courthouse entrance. Normal things, surrounding a morning that was anything but. Dale Pruitt had been paid to silence her before her report triggered an investigation into Warren Price's son. Instead, he'd triggered a federal investigation into everything. She pressed her hand against her ribs and sat with that for a moment. And then she started to stand up because there were things to do and people to talk to, and the morning wasn't over yet, and she'd learned a long time ago that the time between when the truth becomes visible and when it becomes official is the most dangerous window there is. Brooks helped her up from the concrete floor, and neither of them said anything for a moment, because sometimes what has just been understood doesn't need to be restated. The agents around them were moving with practiced efficiency, photographing positions, bagging evidence, running the deputies' IDs through systems that Rachel knew from experience would pull more than just names and addresses. Pruitt was already in cuffs, seated against the far wall with his hands behind his back, and whatever he'd planned to say apparently recalculated somewhere between the zip ties and the arrival of 6 federal badges. He wasn't smiling anymore. She watched him for exactly 3 seconds. Then she stopped watching him because he wasn't the point anymore. "I need to call my lawyer," she said. "He's in the building," Brooks told her. "We contacted him when we saw them follow you in." She looked at him. "You had eyes on me from the courthouse entrance? From your apartment building." He said it without apology. "We anticipated escalation." She absorbed that. There was a version of herself that would have been angry about it, about being watched, managed, moved like a piece on someone else's board without being told. She wasn't entirely not angry, but she also understood operational logic, and the logic here had kept her from something worse than bruised ribs and a split lip. So she filed the anger somewhere accessible and let it sit. Perry Grau met her at the elevator with the expression of a man who had drastically underestimated what kind of case he'd agreed to take. He looked at her face. He looked at the federal agents behind her. He looked at Pruitt on the ground. "Are you injured?" he asked. "I'm functional." "That is not what I asked." "Ribs and lip. I'll have them looked at." She kept walking toward the deposition room because stopping felt wrong, felt like giving the morning more power than it deserved. "Perry, the scope of this has changed." "I can see that." Federal investigators have financials linking Warren Price to Hicks, and there's a connection between Price and the patient I flagged the night before the arrest, Marcus Price, his son. Perry stopped walking. She didn't stop, so he had to catch up. Rachel, stop for a second." She stopped. "You're telling me," he said carefully, "that the reason Pruitt came after you was to suppress a mandatory abuse report." "That's what I'm telling you." He ran a hand over his face. Okay, that changes the legal exposure significantly for everyone involved. That's not just police misconduct anymore. That's obstruction of a child welfare investigation. I know what it is," she said. "Can you handle it, or do I need someone else?" He looked at her, and she saw him make a decision. His shoulders dropped slightly, the way they do when someone stops trying to manage a situation and decides to actually be in it. "I can handle it," he said. "Then let's go." The deposition took 4 hours. She sat across from a federal recorder and 2 investigators she hadn't met before, Voss on one side and a man named Garrett on the other, and she walked them through everything. The arrest, the injuries, the 9 days of documentation she'd kept in her notebook, which she'd brought in a plastic bag because she'd learned years ago to protect your records the way you protect your ammunition, with your body if necessary. The surveillance of her apartment, the call from Brooks, the parking garage that morning. She was precise about times and sequences. She did not editorialize. She had learned that the truth presented cleanly was more devastating than the truth presented dramatically, and she'd had 8 years of practice presenting information under conditions where being imprecise cost lives. Garrett asked her to walk through the initial arrest 3 times. Each time she walked through it the same way, same words, same sequence, because that's what true things do. They stay the same. The 3rd time through, he stopped her at the moment Pruitt had reached for the taser. "You said he was reaching for the taser when you executed a defensive maneuver." "That's correct." "Can you describe the specific technique?" "I used a wrist redirection to break his grip on the device, followed by a takedown that used his own forward momentum. He was uninjured, by choice." A silence. "By choice," Garrett repeated. "He could have had a broken wrist," she said. "I assessed that a wrist fracture was not necessary to stop the immediate threat, so I didn't break it." Voss made a note. Garrett made a note. The recorder kept recording. "You said the zip ties were broken," Garrett continued. "How?" "I rotated my wrist to a specific angle at the moment they were applied and maintained tension. There's a technique, paracord or standard zip restraints. It works the same way." She paused. "It's in the Army Field Manual, or a version of it is. And your service record indicates—" "My service record indicates what it indicates," she said. "Not hostile. Just done with that line of question. I'm not here to talk about my service record. I'm here to tell you what happened to me in this city for the past 11 days, and what I believe happened to the 11 other people on the list you showed me." Garrett looked at Voss. Voss gave him a very small nod. "Tell us about the list," he said. She told them about the list. Quote, "By the time she walked out of the federal building, it was nearly 3 in the afternoon. Her ribs hurt in the specific deep way that suggested at least one of them was cracked rather than simply bruised. She'd had enough cracked ribs in her life to know the difference. She made a mental note to get them taped and then immediately forgot the mental note because her phone had been collecting messages for 4 hours, and she could see from the notification screen that several of them were from numbers she didn't recognize. The first unknown number she called back was a woman named Darlene Marsh. Darlene was 62 years old. She had been arrested by Dale Pruitt 3 years ago on a disorderly conduct charge. She'd eventually pleaded down to a fine of $280. She'd been standing in front of a building that Warren Price's development company had been trying to acquire. She'd been the fourth resident of her block to be arrested that month. She'd been the only one who tried to fight the charge, and the only one who ultimately couldn't afford to keep fighting. "I saw what happened to you on the news," Darlene said. Her voice was steady in the way that voices get steady when they've been angry for a long time about the same thing. "They said you were a nurse, that you attacked an officer." "That's what they said," Rachel agreed. "I knew it wasn't right," Darlene said. "I knew it the minute they said it. That's exactly what they said about me." She stayed on the phone with Darlene for 40 minutes. She got 3 more calls while she was on that one, from 2 men and a woman, each of them with some version of the same story. Different names, different dates, same department, same pattern. A citation that didn't make sense. An escalation that didn't match anything they'd done. An arrest. A charge that was serious enough to be threatening and minor enough that fighting it felt disproportionate. A lawyer who told them the smart move was to plead. A fine. A record. A silence that followed. She wrote down everything they told her. Her notebook was most of the way full by now. She started a second one. Jamie Reeves came by that evening with takeout containers and the specific look of someone who'd spent their day fielding questions they weren't allowed to answer. "Marcia called me into her office today," Jamie said, setting the containers on Rachel's kitchen table. "About?" "About you. About what I know. About whether I'd been in contact with you." She sat down across from Rachel and looked at the 2 notebooks on the table. "I told her I'd driven past your building once to see if you were okay." "That's technically true." "I left out the coffee." Rachel almost smiled. "What did Marcia say?" "That the hospital's legal team has advised staff not to discuss your case, that there's ongoing concern about the hospital's liability exposure." Jamie looked at her. "Rachel, they're worried about being sued. They should be more worried about whether they did the right thing." Jamie was quiet for a moment. "I also heard something through channels. One of the ER docs, Quan, apparently pulled your patient chart from the Price kid's admission. The one from the night before your arrest." Rachel went still. Someone flagged the access. "The hospital's compliance office is asking questions about why a doctor would be reviewing a patient chart for a case that isn't his." "Who asked him to?" Rachel said. "Nobody knows. Or nobody's saying." Jamie pressed her lips together. "But Rachel, if someone is accessing that chart from inside the hospital, trying to alter it, or document what's in it before it becomes evidence—" "The report I filed that night was sent to the county child welfare office," Rachel said. "It's already in their system. It can't be changed now." Jamie let out a slow breath. "Okay. But I need you to do something. Tell me, the physical documentation from that night, the photographs the attending ordered, the notes, the scan results, all of it. Is it still in the system?" "It should be." "I need someone to make sure it stays there, not to pull it, not to touch it, just keep eyes on it. And if anything changes, if any of it gets flagged or moved or amended, I need to know." Jamie looked at her. "If I do that and they find out, then you tell them the truth. That a nurse you know raised a concern about record integrity in an active investigation. That's not a policy violation. That's called protecting a patient." A long silence. "Yeah," Jamie said finally. "Okay, yeah." They ate the takeout and didn't talk much. The apartment was quiet in the way it gets when 2 people are sitting with the weight of something big and neither of them wants to be the one who makes it smaller by naming it out loud. The morning after, Brooks called her at 7. "We have a problem," he said. Not his usual measured opener. Straight to it. "What kind?" "The 4th man from the parking garage, the one who ran. We identified him overnight. His name is Kevin Sorrell. He's not Cedar Ridge PD." She set down her coffee. "Who is he?" "Private security contractor. Company called Meridian Protective Services. Registered in Nevada, principal offices in Denver. 3 clients on their current active roster that we can access." A pause. "Warren Price is one of them." Rachel processed this. Pruitt had been the instrument, but he'd been handed the hammer by someone with more resources than a police captain's salary. She'd understood that since the parking garage. What she was understanding now was that the resources ran deeper than she'd initially estimated. "What's Meridian's background?" she asked. "Former law enforcement, mostly, some former military. They operate in a gray area about client protection, intelligence gathering, what they call risk mitigation." His tone on that last phrase carried something she recognized as professional contempt. 3 of their operatives have prior disciplinary actions in other states. Nothing criminal. Nothing that would prevent licensing. But Sorrell was at that parking garage with 3 police officers. Yes, he was. Which means Price wasn't just paying Hicks. He had his own people coordinating directly with the department. That's what it looks like. She was quiet for a moment. Outside her window, a garbage truck was working its way down her street. Normal morning sounds, a dog somewhere, a kid on a bicycle. "Brooks," she said. "Sorrell ran. What does a man like that do when he runs?" "He reports back. That's standard." So Price knows the parking garage didn't go the way it was supposed to. He knows his people got arrested. He knows the federal investigation has escalated. Yes. What does a man like Price do when everything starts collapsing toward him? A longer pause this time. "He protects his assets," Brooks said, "and cuts loose whatever he can't protect. That's my read." She thought about Hicks, about what it would mean for a police captain to find out that the businessman who'd been insulating him for years was now doing math about what could be sacrificed, about what people in that position typically did with the information they had and the choices they had left. "Have you made contact with Hicks?" she asked. "We've been building toward it. We didn't want to move too fast and have him lawyer up before we had full financials." "Move faster," she said. "We're aware of the timeline." "Brooks." She said his name the way she'd once said things in briefings, when the assessment was done and the recommendation was clear and there wasn't room for diplomatic phrasing. If Price starts cutting loose his contacts and Hicks knows it's coming, Hicks is going to make a decision. Either he cooperates or he disappears whatever he still has access to. You have maybe 48 hours before one of those things happens. A silence on the line. She could hear him thinking. "I'll bring it to the team," he said. "That's not a no." "No," he said. "It's not a no." The hearing on her criminal charges was moved up to Friday, 3 days earlier than originally scheduled. Perry called her about it Tuesday afternoon with the specific controlled alarm of a man trying to project confidence he wasn't fully feeling. "The prosecution filed a motion to accelerate the hearing date," he said. Judge Tanaka approved it. "Why would they want to accelerate?" "Technically, they cited scheduling, but my read—" He stopped, started again. "My read is that someone on the prosecution side still has ties to Hicks's office and is hoping to get this resolved before the federal case builds any further momentum. If they can get a conviction, even a small one, even a plea, before the federal investigation becomes public, it limits the narrative." "Can they?" "If we go in Friday without the federal case visible yet, it becomes a much harder story for us. Our strongest argument is the context, the pattern, the other victims, the financials, the Price connection. If that's still sealed, then it's still just a nurse who attacked a cop." Essentially, she sat with that. The window again, the street. "Perry," she said, "can you file for a delay?" "I can try. Tanaka is not going to be easy. He's been on this bench for 16 years and he doesn't like last-minute motions from the defense. But if Brooks can provide, I'll call Brooks. Rachel, if the federal case isn't ready to surface, then we surface what we have," she said. "The deposition is already on record. The parking garage footage is evidence, the 12 names, the timeline." She thought about Darlene Marsh's voice on the phone, steady and tired and patient. "We don't need the full case to be visible. We just need enough. Enough can mean a lot of different things in a courtroom." "I know. Get me the filing deadline." He called back in 20 minutes. Filing deadline was 10 a.m. Thursday. She had 36 hours. She called Brooks. She called Voss. She called Darlene Marsh and 3 of the other victims and asked them, carefully, if they were willing to be named in a legal filing. 2 said yes immediately. Darlene said yes before she'd finished asking. The 4th said she needed to think about it, which Rachel told her was completely reasonable and meant it. She spent most of Tuesday night at her kitchen table with the notebooks and Perry on the phone and a yellow legal pad where she was building the timeline, connecting dates to names to incidents to paperwork in the specific methodical way that she'd once used to plan movements through landscapes where the wrong sequence of actions had permanent consequences. At 2 a.m., she made herself stop and sleep for 4 hours, because she'd learned the hard way that decision-making on no sleep was indistinguishable from bad decision-making for a reason. At 6 a.m., she was back at the table. At 8:15 a.m., her phone rang. Unknown number. Wyoming area code. She answered. The voice on the other end was male, older, and very controlled. Not the practiced control of someone trained to be calm under pressure. The control of someone choosing each word like it cost money. Ms. Foster, my name is Roland Hicks. The kitchen went quiet. She looked at the notebooks on the table. 12 names, 4 victims who'd called her back. One man now on the phone who'd ordered the erasure of evidence against all of them. She kept her voice completely neutral. Captain Hicks, she said. I'd like to meet with you, he said. Without lawyers, without federal investigators. That's not something I'm inclined to do. I think, he said carefully, that there are things I can tell you that would be valuable to your case, and things I can give you that no federal investigation has found yet. A pause. I'm not calling to threaten you. I want you to understand that. I understand that you're calling me at 6 hours before Perry Grau files a motion that names you specifically. I think the timing is relevant. Silence. Price knows I've been subpoenaed, Hicks said. His control slipped slightly for the first time. Just a fraction. He's already talking to people about how to limit his exposure. And I am... A pause. Something moving across the line. I've spent 11 years building something in this city, and he is going to burn it to the ground to save himself. She pressed her palm flat against the legal pad on the table. Captain, she said, if you want to talk, you call Perry Grau and you request a meeting with federal investigators present. That is the conversation I will have with you, not this one. A long silence. If I go through official channels, he said, I lose everything. You lost everything, she said, the morning you told Dale Pruitt to turn off his body camera. She hung up the phone and sat in the quiet kitchen for a moment, heart moving a little faster than usual, and then she picked up her pen and wrote the time and the content of the call in the notebook, in the same neat print she used for everything, and then she called Perry. But even as she was dialing, something sat wrong with her. Something about the call. About the timing, yes, that was obvious. But also about something Hicks had said. The specific way he'd said it. He's already talking to people about how to limit his exposure. Not to lawyers, not to investigators. People. She thought about Kevin Sorrell, the Meridian contractor, who had run from the parking garage and reported back to Warren Price. She thought about what a man like Price did when the walls closed in. She thought about Marcus Price, 16 years old, in a hospital bed with a punctured lung and bruising that didn't match the accident. The reason any of this had started. Where was Marcus Price right now? Perry picked up and she told him about the Hicks call, and he said the appropriate things, and they talked through the filing, and it was professional and clear. And the whole time, in the back of her head, running parallel, Marcus Price, 16, Warren Price's son. The piece of this nobody had talked about since the parking garage revelation. She waited until after the call with Perry to ask the question out loud. She called Voss. The Price kid, Rachel said. Marcus. Where is he right now? Post-discharge? A pause on Voss's end that was a fraction too long. He was discharged from Pine Valley 4 days after admission, Voss said. And now? Another pause. Ms. Foster, that's part of an active... Voss. She kept her voice flat. If Price knows his operation is collapsing, and he has a son who is currently a material witness to abuse, and that son is somewhere accessible to him, that's not a peripheral concern. That's a priority. The pause this time was different, the kind that means someone is making a decision. We're aware, Voss said. We're working on it. Are you working on it like you were working on the parking garage, or are you actually moving? A longer silence. I'll make a call, Voss said. Rachel hung up and stood in the center of her apartment with the morning light coming through the window at a flat angle and the notebooks on the table, and the legal pad covered in her handwriting and the phone warm in her hand. She was missing something. She could feel it the way she'd once felt the shape of a problem in a dark and unfamiliar environment. Not seeing it yet, but knowing it was there. Her medical report for Marcus Price's admission was already in the county welfare system. It couldn't be altered. But there was another document, something she hadn't thought about in the chaos of the past week and a half. The attending physician's notes, Dr. Kwan's notes. The Dr. Jamie had mentioned, the one who'd accessed the chart from outside his regular caseload. The one the compliance office was asking about. She called Jamie. "The chart access," she said when Jamie picked up. "Kwan, when exactly did he access Marcus Price's file?" She could hear Jamie moving, a door closing quietly. Somewhere private. "I checked," Jamie said. "Yesterday, 3:17 in the afternoon." Yesterday afternoon. 6 hours after Pruitt had been arrested in the parking garage. "Jamie," Rachel said carefully, "does Kwan have any connection to Price? Professionally, personally, anything?" A silence, then very quietly. "His practice does medical consulting for 2 commercial properties in Cedar Ridge. Both of those properties are owned by a holding company." Another silence. "I looked it up last night. Rachel, I don't know if this is what it looks like." "What's the holding company?" "Ridgemont Commercial Properties, LLC." Rachel wrote it down. "Find out who the registered agent is," she said. She already knew the answer before Jamie called back 12 minutes later to confirm it. Ridgemont Commercial Properties, LLC. Registered agent, Warren A. Price. She sat down slowly. Inside Pine Valley Medical Center, someone with access to Marcus Price's medical file had reviewed it the afternoon after Pruitt's arrest, and that someone had a financial relationship with Warren Price. If Price was looking for what Rachel had documented that night, if he was trying to understand exactly what evidence existed before it became federal exhibit paperwork, if he found something in those records that he thought he could use or suppress or get ahead of, she picked up her phone and called Brooks. He answered on the first ring. "I need you to pull a warrant," she said. "Pine Valley Medical Center. Specific patient records. Tonight." A pause. "What did you find?" "A doctor with a Price connection accessed the chart I flagged the night before my arrest. Yesterday afternoon, after your people arrested Pruitt. Rachel, if those records get altered or pulled before we secure them, we lose the original reason any of this started. The abuse report, the connection to Marcus Price, the reason Hicks sent Pruitt after me in the first place. Without that document chain, Price's lawyers can argue this whole investigation was about a traffic stop." She could hear him moving, voices in the background. "I'll have Voss on it in 20 minutes, he said. 15, she said. A brief silence. 15, he agreed. She hung up and looked at the notebooks and the legal pad and the second notebook that was half full now, and she thought about the fact that it was Wednesday morning, and in less than 48 hours she would walk into a courtroom on criminal charges in a city where the police captain had just called her privately from an unknown number, and where a doctor inside her own hospital had just accessed a record that was the foundation of everything. And she thought about Hicks's voice, the fraction of control that had slipped when he'd talked about Price cutting him loose. He's already talking to people about how to limit his exposure. Not lawyers. People. She picked up her pen. She wrote, "Who else is Price talking to?" And under that, "Who else is still inside this that we haven't found yet?" She stared at the page for a long time. Then her phone buzzed with a text from a number she didn't have saved. No name. Just a Cedar Ridge area code and 7 words. The evidence room. Check what's already missing. She stared at the text for 4 seconds, then screenshotted it and sent it to Brooks and Voss simultaneously before she did anything else. Because the first rule of receiving information from an unknown source was to not be the only one holding it. Then she called the number back. It rang 6 times. No voicemail. Deadline. She put the phone down and stood in her kitchen and thought about who in Cedar Ridge PD would know what was in the evidence room and would have a reason to tell her about it through an anonymous text at 7 in the morning. The answer to that was someone on the inside who had decided, for whatever reason, conscience, fear, self-preservation, some combination of all 3, that the situation had tilted past the point where staying quiet was the safer option, which meant the situation inside the department had tilted, faster than she'd expected. Brooks called back in 4 minutes. "We got your screenshot," he said. "Do you know who sent it?" "No, the number's dead." "We'll run it." A pause. "Rachel, if someone inside the Cedar Ridge PD is reaching out to you directly rather than to us, that's significant." "I know what it is," she said. "What matters is whether it's accurate. Is there something missing from the evidence room?" A silence that told her he already knew the answer. "The dash cam footage," he said, "from a unit that was 2 blocks from your arrest on the morning of the incident, potentially captured the tail end of the stop before Pruitt's body cam went off. We requested it as part of the standard evidence package. The department logged it as received and tagged for preservation. But it's not there. It was signed out 2 days after your arrest. Chain of custody log lists it as transferred to the DA's office for review. The DA's office has no record of receiving it." She pressed her hand flat on the counter. "So it's gone. The physical drive is gone. Whether there's a backup copy somewhere in the system. That's what we're working on." "Who signed it out?" "A deputy named Farrow, Kyle Farrow. He's been with the department 9 years, no prior disciplinary record." She wrote the name down. "Is Farrow still reporting for duty?" "Called in sick Monday. Hasn't been in since." She looked at the name on the pad. Kyle Farrow, she thought. 9 years in the department. No disciplinary record. And 3 days ago, someone had walked a piece of evidence out the door and then disappeared. "It was him," she said. "The text." "Possibly. If he took the drive to destroy it and then lost his nerve, or if he took it to preserve it," Brooks said quietly, "and is now sitting somewhere deciding whether the risk of coming forward is worth what he's holding." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the garbage truck had moved on, just the street now, ordinary and still. "Can you find him?" she asked. "We're looking." A pause. "The warrant for Pine Valley came through 20 minutes ago. Voss is at the hospital now." "Good." "Rachel." His voice shifted slightly, not softer exactly, but more direct. "The hearing is in 36 hours. If Farrow has that footage and we can't locate him before then we go in with what we have," she said. "What we have is strong, but not airtight." "Nothing is ever airtight," she said. "You work with what's real." She could hear him exhale, not quite a sigh, more like someone adjusting their grip on something heavy. "Perry filed the motion an hour ago," he said. She hadn't known that. She looked at the clock, 8:40. "Tanaka?" "No ruling yet." "Okay." She picked up her pen. "Keep looking for Farrow." Voss called from Pine Valley at 9:20 with the controlled urgency that Rachel was beginning to understand was her baseline register for anything that mattered. "The chart is intact," Voss said. "Your original documentation, the attending's notes from the night of admission, the imaging records, all present and unaltered." Kwan's access. He viewed the records but made no edits, no annotations, no amendments. A pause. "We've pulled his access logs going back 60 days. He's accessed 4 patient charts outside his normal caseload in that period. 3 of them are properties under the Ridgemont umbrella, workers' comp situations. The 4th is Marcus Price." "When did those 3 access his other charts?" 2 last month, 1 3 weeks ago." Voss's voice was precise. "In all 3 cases, within 48 hours of the access, the workers' comp claims were dropped." Rachel stood very still. "He was reviewing records to give Price information," she said. "Not a question." "That's what it looks like. We don't yet know how the information was communicated. Direct contact, intermediary. But the pattern is clear." A brief pause. "We have enough for an obstruction charge on Kwan, possibly more once we look deeper." "Marcus Price," Rachel said. "Voss, I need to know where the kid is." A pause, longer than before. "He's not with his mother," Voss said carefully. "We've made contact with her. She and Marcus have been in... She's been attempting to leave the marriage. It's complicated." "Complicated how?" "Warren Price controls the finances, the house, the vehicles, the son's school enrollment, his medical providers." Voss stopped. "Ms. Price, Marcus's mother, Diane. She was not fully aware of what happened to her son the night of the accident. What your report described. The specific weight of that settled on Rachel like something physical. She didn't know. Her understanding was that Marcus was in an accident, that he was hurt, and it was accidental. The story at home was... Voss's voice was careful, professionally even, but there was something underneath it that wasn't professional, not entirely. The story was different from what your report documented. Rachel sat down at the kitchen table. She thought about the boy's face, the fear in his eyes that she'd recognized because she'd seen that specific fear before, in other places, on other people, and it had a shape to it that was different from ordinary fear, more interior, more practiced. "Where's Marcus now?" she asked again. "He went to school Monday and Tuesday. He did not appear at school yesterday." Another pause. "Diane Price went to the house yesterday morning to pick up some of her belongings. Her access code had been changed. She has not been able to reach Marcus directly." Rachel's hand tightened on the phone. "Price has the boy," she said. "We don't know that he..." "Voss. Warren Price's entire operation is collapsing. His paid officers are under federal arrest. His contractor ran from a parking garage. His police captain called me privately this morning because he's panicking. And the 16-year-old at the center of the original abuse report, who is also his son, who is also a witness, has been absent from school for 2 days and can't be reached by his mother." She kept her voice flat. "He has the boy." Silence on the line. "We're trying to locate..." "Try harder," Rachel said. "Try like it's urgent." She hung up, and for a moment she just sat with the specific sick clarity of understanding that she had been so focused on the legal architecture of her own case that she had not kept the original reason for any of it at the center where it belonged. A 16-year-old kid with a punctured lung who'd looked at her in the ER with eyes that had been afraid for a long time before that night. She picked up her phone and called Brooks. "Marcus Price," she said the moment he answered. "I need you to treat his location as a priority. Not a secondary concern, not something we'll get to. A priority. Today." A pause. Voices in the background on his end, movement. "We're already making calls," he said. What kind of calls?" "Child Protective Services. Wyoming Division of Criminal Investigation. The school district. We're building a welfare check framework. Brooks." She cut through it. "A welfare check framework takes time. A man like Price, with money and connections and the specific knowledge that everything is closing in on him. If he has that kid somewhere, a welfare check framework is not what breaks through." "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that if there's any intelligence on where Price is physically right now, where he's been in the last 48 hours, vehicles, properties, anything Meridian has been contracted to cover, you need to be moving on that now, not building toward it, now." A silence that was doing a lot of work. "I'll call you back," Brooks said. He called back in 11 minutes. "Price owns a property," he said. "Outside Cedar Ridge, 12 miles northeast, up toward the Laramie Range. It's registered to another holding company, not Ridgemont, a different one. We missed it in the initial asset search because it's 3 ownership layers deep." "How big?" "Ranch style. 12 acres. 1 main structure, 2 outbuildings. The property's been accessed in the last 48 hours. There's a fuel card transaction at a station 6 miles from the gate from a vehicle registered to Meridian Protective Services." "Sorrel," she said. "The contractor who ran from the garage." "Possibly. Or another Meridian asset." She stood up from the table. Her ribs pressed back. She ignored them. "Are you moving on it?" "We're coordinating with DCI and the county sheriff's office. We need a warrant. You have a missing juvenile who is the documented victim of abuse and whose mother cannot reach him, and who has not appeared at school for 2 days, and you have evidence placing a known criminal associate at a property his father owns under a concealed corporate structure." She kept her voice level with effort. "That's exigent circumstance, Brooks. That's enough." Another silence. "Give me 30 minutes, he said. 20, she said. She was lacing her boots when Perry called. Tanaka denied the motion, he said. She stopped lacing. He denied it. He said the defense had not demonstrated sufficient grounds for delay, that the prosecution's request for acceleration was procedurally sound, and that the public interest in resolving the matter expediently. Perry's voice carried the specific frustration of a man who knew the outcome before he heard the reasoning. He denied it, Rachel. We're in court tomorrow morning at 9. She finished lacing the boot, moved to the second one. Okay, she said. Okay? Rachel, if we go in there tomorrow without the federal case on the table, Perry, I need you to prepare for trial as though we're going in with what we already have on record. The deposition, the victim's statements, the parking garage footage, the body cam timestamp, the inconsistent police reports. She stood up. Because we might be. And if the federal case breaks before 9 a.m., then we use it. She grabbed her jacket. Be ready for both. That's the job. Where are you going? He'd caught something in the background. Her keys. I need some air, she said. She was in her car and moving before she'd fully decided to be. She told herself she was driving to clear her head, to think through the hearing prep, to do any of the rational things a person with a trial tomorrow and bruised ribs and too little sleep should be doing. She was not doing any of those things. She was driving northeast toward the Laramie Range, because there was a 16-year-old somewhere in that direction, and the institutional machinery was moving at the speed that institutional machinery moves, and she had a different set of instincts from a different part of her life that were louder right now than anything else. She called Brooks from the road. Rachel. His voice was immediately alert. Where are you? Driving. A pause. Driving where? Tell me the property address. Rachel, I'm not going to do anything, she said. I need to see the location. I need to understand the terrain. I have a trial tomorrow morning, and the only thing that resolves this cleanly before 9 a.m. is if you find that boy tonight. She kept her eyes on the road. The city was falling behind her, the land opening up into the flat, wide expanse that preceded the mountain rise. Give me the address, and I'll stay on the perimeter. I won't approach. A long silence. You are the worst kind of problem, Brooks said. Not angrily. With the tone of a person who recognizes a situation as inevitable and is adjusting accordingly. He gave her the address. She drove. The property was set back from a 2-lane county road behind a timber gate that was padlocked and posted with a no trespassing sign that had been recently added. The paint was still sharp, the screws still bright. She pulled off the road 200 meters shy of the gate and cut her engine and sat looking at the structure visible in the middle distance through bare trees. Main house. 2 outbuildings to the left. A vehicle she couldn't fully identify parked beside the far outbuilding. She watched for 8 minutes. No movement. No visible security. Curtains drawn on the main house. Then she saw the light. It was in the main house, second window from the right on the ground floor. The curtain moved slightly. Not wind. There was no wind. And for just a moment, the edge of the curtain pulled back, and she saw a hand. Small. Young. She made herself stay in the car. She called Brooks. There's someone in the main house, she said, keeping her voice completely level. Ground floor, second window from the right. Young hand on the curtain. I need your team here now. We have a warrant, he said. We're 10 minutes out. 8 would be better. Rachel, do not approach that structure. She looked at the window. The curtain had dropped back into place. I'm on the perimeter, she said. I'm staying on the perimeter. She ended the call. 7 minutes. She could give them 7 minutes before something changed inside that house. Before someone made a different calculation. Price was a man who'd built his operation on controlling what other people could prove, and right now the architecture of his control was coming apart simultaneously on 5 different fronts, and the one thing left inside that house that connected every front together was a 16-year-old boy who had not chosen any of this. She opened her car door and stepped out into the cold Wyoming air. She did not approach the structure. She moved to the tree line to her left and found a position with a clear sight line to the front of the house and the vehicle by the outbuilding, because that was what staying on the perimeter meant to someone with her training. Not staying in the car, having eyes and cover. From the tree line, she could see things she hadn't from the road. A second vehicle, behind the far outbuilding, dark SUV, rear cargo door open, and a figure moving between the outbuilding and the SUV, loading something. Boxes. Moving with the specific, purposeful efficiency of someone who had decided the window for departure was narrowing. Not Price. Price was a businessman. The figure moved like sorrel, like someone trained for exactly this kind of operational exit. And if they were loading the SUV, then somewhere very close to that calculation was a decision about what to do with the one loose end that couldn't be boxed up and driven away. She pressed her back to the tree and pulled out her phone. Brooks answered before it finished its first ring. "They're loading a vehicle," she said. "Rear of the property. I have eyes on one Meridian-type asset, possibly Sorrel. They're moving to Exville." Rachel. "They're going to run with the boy or leave him, one or the other. You have maybe 4 minutes before that SUV moves." She watched the figure carry another box. "Brooks, are you 4 minutes out?" A sound on the line. Vehicles, wind, movement. "3, he said. "Then move," she said. "Right now, move." She heard him relay the order through whatever command channel they were using, heard the change in background sound that meant vehicles accelerating, and she held her position in the tree line with her eyes on the property and her ribs sending steady signals that she was continuing to ignore. And she counted seconds, the way she'd once counted seconds in situations where seconds were the actual currency of outcome. The figure by the SUV stopped moving. He'd heard something, or felt something, that particular shift in an environment when a perimeter has changed, when the geometry of a situation has altered in a way your body registers before your brain does. He turned toward the road. And then he looked directly at the tree line, directly at her position. She stayed completely still. Training was training, but there were 12 feet of open ground between the trees and the fence line, and she was looking at a man who moved like he'd been in enough bad situations to recognize another one forming, and who was now reaching for something at his hip with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who had already made his decision. From the county road behind her came the sound of vehicles, Brooks's team, closing fast. From inside the main house came a sound she had not expected, a door, opening. And then a voice, young, male, unsteady, but doing its best to not be. "Hey!" Marcus Price's voice from somewhere inside the fence line, somewhere she couldn't see. "Hey, stop! What are you—" The figure with his hand at his hip half turned toward the voice, and Rachel moved. Not toward the figure, toward the fence. 12 feet of open ground and a 4-foot timber fence, and she cleared it in a movement that her ribs immediately and emphatically protested. And she landed in the property on the other side and came up running, because the sound of Brooks's vehicles was 30 seconds away, and the figure was turning back toward her, and she needed to be between him and the boy. She was. She put herself in the gap between the figure and the direction of Marcus Price's voice, and she stood there. And she looked at the man across 12 feet of dead Wyoming grass, and she said, with the specific quiet certainty of someone who has been in worse positions than this and knows it, "Put it down." The man looked at her. He looked at the approaching vehicles. He looked at her again. His hand stayed where it was. And from behind Rachel, from the direction of the house, came the sound of the front door opening, and Marcus Price stepped out into the cold with his arms wrapped around himself and his eyes adjusting to the morning light. And he looked at Rachel and then at the man with his hand at his hip, and his expression did something complicated that she recognized from the ER. The specific face of a person whose body has been in a state of sustained fear for so long that the possibility of it ending doesn't register immediately as relief. It registers as disbelief. The first vehicle came through the gate. They'd broken the padlock. And then 2 more behind it, and everything happened in the specific, fast, coordinated way that it happens when trained people finally arrive in sufficient numbers to make individual calculations irrelevant. And the figure with his hand at his hip made the only rational choice left and put both hands up and stepped back. Rachel stood in the dead grass with her hand pressed to her ribs and watched federal agents move through the property, and she looked at Marcus Price standing on the porch in his socks on a cold Wednesday morning, and something in her chest that had been locked down tight since the moment she'd first seen his chart loosened by a fraction. Brooks appeared beside her. He looked at her. He looked at the fence she'd cleared. "You said you were staying on the perimeter," he said. "I was on the perimeter," she said. Then the perimeter moved. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully read. Then his radio crackled, and a voice she recognized said 3 words that changed the shape of everything. Hicks just walked in. Brooks was already moving toward his vehicle when Rachel fell in to step beside him, and he didn't tell her to stay behind, which she took as acknowledgement that they were past the point where that conversation was worth having. "Where?" she asked. "Federal Field Office. Downtown." He came in with a lawyer, no prior contact, just walked through the front door at 8:52 and told the desk agent he wanted to make a statement. Brooks was on his radio simultaneously, coordinating handoff on the Price property, making sure the custody chain on Sorrel was clean. He was good at moving in multiple directions at once. She respected that. "Voss is already there." "What did he bring?" "Don't know yet." She got in the passenger side of his vehicle without being invited. He drove. The property receded behind them in the side mirror, agents moving through the grounds, Marcus Price being walked toward a DCI vehicle with a blanket around his shoulders, the SUV with the open cargo door sitting exactly where it had been. "The boy," she said. "DCI has him. His mother's been contacted. She's on her way." Rachel watched the road. She thought about Diane Price getting a phone call and not knowing whether to be relieved or terrified, and probably being both at once, and driving toward her son without knowing what the next 24 hours looked like. She thought about Hicks walking into a federal office at 8:52 in the morning with a lawyer and no prior contact, and what that meant. "He didn't negotiate first," she said. Brooks glanced at her. "Hicks," she said. "If he was doing a calculated cooperation deal, he would have had his lawyer make contact first, set terms, test the water. He just walked in." She looked at the road. Something pushed him. This morning. Something happened that moved his timeline. Price, Brooks said, Price did something. Or Hicks found out Price was about to do something. She thought about the phone call, the fraction of control that had slipped. "He called me at 7 this morning, not his lawyer, me. And 2 hours later, he walks into your office. He was looking for options. He was looking to see if I'd give him a softer landing than the federal process would. I didn't. So he took the federal process." She pressed her hand to her ribs, which were informing her at regular intervals that they were cracked and would appreciate being taped. "Whatever he's bringing, it's everything. He's not coming in with half a hand. He walked in with no negotiation, which means he brought something big enough that he doesn't need to negotiate." Brooks said nothing. He was thinking it through himself, and she could see it in the set of his jaw. 2 lanes of Wyoming highway, flat light, the city coming back into view. "He's going to give us Price," she said. "That's the hope." "Don't hope," she said. "Prepare for what it means when he does, because Price's lawyers are going to be filing motions within an hour of whatever Hicks puts on the table, and Perry needs to be in that building when it happens." She was already dialing. The Federal Field Office on Clement Street was a low brick building that from the outside looked like it could have been a regional insurance office. Inside it had the specific atmosphere of spaces where consequential things happen in undramatic ways. Carpet, fluorescent lights, the smell of institutional coffee, people moving with purpose in normal clothes. Voss met them in the corridor outside the interview suite. She had a tablet and the look of someone who'd been awake since at least 4 a.m. and was running on professional momentum and not much else. "He's talking," she said, not waiting for Brooks to ask. "Has been since 9:15. His lawyer is present, but he's barely used her. He wants to talk." "What's he given us?" Brooks asked. Voss looked at Rachel, and the look contained something that Rachel read as, "This is relevant to you specifically." 11 years, Voss said. "He's detailing 11 years of it. Arrangement with Price started in year 2 of his captaincy. Initially small, Price would tip him to properties he was trying to acquire, and Hicks would make sure the city's code enforcement prioritized differently. Citation patterns, nuisance complaints, nothing overtly criminal." She glanced at her tablet. Then it grew. Price's development projects needed certain people to stop filing complaints, stop attending zoning meetings, stop being visible. Hicks found that certain officers were amenable to persuasion. Pruitt was the primary instrument from year 4 onward. 14 incidents total, not 12. 2 were buried deep enough that they didn't appear in the initial list. 14, Rachel thought. The Meridian connection, Brooks said. Year 7. Price decided he needed capability that the police department couldn't provide with full deniability. He contracted Meridian as a private parallel track. Hicks knew. He facilitated access. "And me," Rachel said. Voss met her eyes. Hicks says Price contacted him the morning after Marcus was admitted. He'd been notified by hospital administration that a mandatory report had been filed. He knew the report would trigger an investigation. He told Hicks he needed the reporting nurse discredited or removed before the investigation opened. The corridor was quiet. Someone passed at the far end with a stack of folders. Coffee machine noise from somewhere. Hicks gave the order to Pruitt, Rachel said. Hicks gave the order. Pruitt selected the method. Voss's voice stayed even. Professional. Captain Hicks states that the intent was intimidation and employment termination, not the severity of what occurred. That's the part he wants credit for, Rachel said. The line between what he ordered and what Pruitt chose to do. Yes. Will it hold up? Voss tilted her head slightly. What he ordered is still obstruction of a child welfare investigation, conspiracy, abuse of authority, evidence tampering. The line he's drawing doesn't reduce his exposure significantly, but it's the line he's drawing, and he's drawing it consistently. Brooks looked at Rachel. He also says there's financial documentation, payments from Price to accounts he controls going back 9 years. He says he knows where it is and he's prepared to provide access. Where? Account in a bank in Casper, registered in his wife's maiden name. Voss paused. His wife doesn't know. The specific texture of that landed in the room. Rachel thought about what it meant to discover, alongside everything else, that your husband had built a second financial architecture in your name without your knowledge. She filed it and moved forward. The hearing is in 18 hours, she said. Perry is on his way in. What can we put in front of Tanaka? If Hicks's cooperation is formalized and the financial documentation is verified, we can request an emergency stay, Voss said. Federal investigation active, key witness cooperating, material connection to the charges against the defendant. Tanaka will have a harder time denying a stay with that on the table. He denied a delay motion 3 hours ago. A delay motion from the defense is different from a federal request for a stay based on active cooperation, Voss said. Those are different legal instruments in different registers. Tanaka knows the difference. Perry arrived 11 minutes later, slightly out of breath, carrying a leather bag that looked like it had survived longer than most of the careers it had accompanied. He shook hands with Brooks and Voss and looked at Rachel's face with the specific expression of a man who keeps finding things worse than the last time he checked. The ribs, she said before he could ask. I wasn't going to say anything. You were. After the hearing. He set the bag on a chair in the corridor and opened it. Walk me through what Hicks has given us. I need to know what we can use in court and what's still sealed. They stood in the corridor of the federal building and built the structure. It was not elegant. There were gaps, places where the documentation was pending verification, places where the chain of custody on certain evidence needed another step before it was courtroom ready. Brooks was direct about the gaps. Perry probed each one. Rachel listened and noted and said what needed saying when it needed to be said. At 10:45, a paralegal Rachel hadn't met brought Perry a document to review. He read it standing up, turned a page, read further, turned back. Hicks signed the cooperation agreement? He asked. At 10:31, Voss confirmed. Perry looked at Rachel. Federal request for stay goes in at 11. If Tanaka takes it by end of day, we're not in court tomorrow morning. And if he doesn't take it by end of day, then we're in court tomorrow morning. He held her gaze. But we're in a very different courtroom than we would have been yesterday. Oh, Tanaka granted the stay at 2:40 in the afternoon. It wasn't enthusiastic. His written ruling was 2 paragraphs and used the word reluctant in the first sentence, which Perry said was Tanaka's way of noting for the record that he didn't enjoy being moved, but he was being moved because the facts required it. Rachel read the ruling on her phone standing in the federal building's parking lot in cold air that was doing more for her focus than anything else had that day. She sat in her car for a few minutes after reading it. The stay was not a resolution. It was a door. What walked through it depended on what happened next, and what happened next was still not certain. Courts were not outcomes, they were processes, and processes had a specific relationship with truth that was useful but imperfect. She knew that. She wasn't naive enough to feel relief yet. What she felt, mostly, was tired. The kind of tired that isn't fixed by sleep, that accumulates over specific kinds of experience and has to be worked off over time. Her phone buzzed. A Cedar Ridge number she didn't recognize. She answered it. "Miss Foster." Male voice. Older. Controlled, but differently controlled than Hicks. More finished. "This is Warren Price." Her hand tightened on the phone by a fraction. "Mr. Price," she said, "I think we should talk." "I think you should be talking to your lawyers," she said. "I am talking to my lawyers." His voice was smooth. Cedar Ridge money, Wyoming old families, the particular accent of someone who had been comfortable long enough that it had become structural. "I'm talking to you in addition to that. I don't know what you think this conversation accomplishes. I want you to understand something," he said, "before this becomes a public proceeding. Before whatever Hicks has told your investigators gets formalized and filed and becomes part of a permanent record." A pause. Precisely placed. Rachel Mara Foster, Army Combat Medic. Classified deployments. Meritorious Service Medal. What else? Not questions. He was reading from something. "You know as well as I do that people with your background have complicated relationships with how much attention they want." She kept her breathing even. "Your son," she said. "He's 16 years old. He's been hurt for long enough that he was afraid in a hospital bed in a way that I recognized, and I have seen a lot of afraid people." "You called me to talk about my background?" A silence. The first uncontrolled one. Your son is safe," she said. "He's with his mother, which is where he should have been instead of in a property 12 miles outside Cedar Ridge with one of your contractors." She looked at the parking lot. Empty space. Ordinary concrete. "Mr. Price, whatever you were planning to say to me on this call, I need you to understand that this conversation is documented. The number you called from is documented. The time is documented. I'm going to end this call now and report it to federal investigators, and they are going to add it to everything else." "Everything else isn't as solid as you think it is," he said. His voice had lost some of its finish. Not much, but some. "Hicks is a man who has protected himself by implicating others before. There are things in his history." "Mr. Price," she said. "Goodbye." She ended the call and immediately took a screenshot of the number and sent it to Brooks and Voss, and then sat in the car and let herself feel what she actually felt, which was a cold, specific anger that she'd been managing since the morning in the parking lot, where Pruitt had stood over her and said what he'd said, and which she was going to continue to manage because anger that was managed was useful and anger that wasn't was how you made mistakes. Price had called her to intimidate her and to test what she knew and to determine whether she could be rattled, and he'd found out the answer to all three. She started the car. Brooks called while she was driving. "Price's lawyers filed a motion to suppress Hicks's cooperation agreement 45 minutes ago on procedural grounds," he said. "Federal judge denied it in 20 minutes. What grounds did they use?" "Claimed Hicks was coerced, that the cooperation wasn't voluntary. He walked in off the street." "With a lawyer," Brooks said, "which is why the denial was fast. But it tells us something. Price's legal team is in reactive mode. They're filing anything that might stick, which means they're also pulling financials, moving assets. We have a freeze order on everything we know about. There's a lag risk on the accounts we've identified in the last 48 hours, but we're moving as fast as we can legally move." She thought about the account in Casper, in Hicks's wife's maiden name. 9 years of payments. If Price's team had advance notice that Hicks had given that information, "The Casper account," she said. "Have you moved on it?" A brief pause. "The order was filed 40 minutes ago." "Price called me 12 minutes ago," she said. "He was testing what I knew. He may have been buying time." A longer pause. "I'll check the status," Brooks said, and she could hear him reaching for something, moving. Then, "The account access shows a transaction, 12:18 p.m. She looked at the dashboard clock. 12:34, 16 minutes ago. "How much?" she asked. $412,000, transferred out. She pressed her hand flat on the steering wheel. Price had made the call, kept her on the phone for 3 minutes, and simultaneously moved money. The call hadn't been a test. The call had been a distraction. "How much got out?" she asked. "All of it. Transfer to an international account. We've filed for recovery through interagency channels, but..." Brooks stopped. "Rachel, I'm sorry. We had the order in motion, but the transaction beat it by 11 minutes. 11 minutes. She sat with that. $400,000 that represented 9 years of payments from a powerful man to a police captain for the systematic destruction of people's lives. And it had moved through a wire transfer while she was sitting in a parking lot listening to Warren Price use her military record like a weapon. He knew, she said. He'd already instructed his people to move it before he called me. The call was to ensure I was occupied. That's our assessment. Can you recover it? Possibly. International financial recovery is slow and uncertain. We'll try. A pause. But Rachel, it doesn't change the criminal case. The account existed. Hicks documented the payments, the account holder name, the transaction history we have from before today. That's all still evidence of the original crime. He moved it because he's afraid, she said. Yes. Good, she said. He should be. That afternoon moved the way afternoons do when a complex situation has crested and is now moving under its own momentum. Fast in some ways, grinding in others. Voss's team worked through Hicks's documentation, building the financial timeline from the records they had. Perry worked with the federal prosecutors on the evidentiary package for the case against Rachel, which was now officially a formality pending dismissal, though the formal motion hadn't been filed yet. Brooks coordinated with DCY on the Sorrell arrest and the Meridian angle, which was opening into its own parallel investigation. Rachel drove to an urgent care clinic at 2 p.m. and had her ribs wrapped by a physician's assistant named Torres, who asked what happened, and she said she'd fallen, which Torres clearly didn't believe but was professional enough not to press. 2 cracked ribs, as she'd estimated. Rest and NSAIDs and no sudden movements, Torres said, and looked at her in a way that suggested she knew exactly how seriously Rachel was going to take that. She was back at the federal building by 3:30. At 4:15, something broke in the Pruitt case that changed the geometry of everything. Kyle Farrow walked in. He was thinner than his department photo, and he had the look of someone who had not slept in a meaningful way for several days. He was carrying a laptop bag and wearing his own clothes, no uniform, and he told the desk agent he had evidence in the Foster case and he wanted to give it to federal investigators. Rachel was in the corridor when they walked him past. Their eyes met for a moment. He was maybe 40, sandy hair going gray. He looked like someone who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and had run out of a reason to keep carrying it. She gave him a single nod. He held her gaze for a second and then looked away. The drive from the dash cam unit was intact. He'd taken it, he told Voss in the subsequent interview, not to destroy it. He'd never intended to destroy it, but because he'd seen what was on it and he'd panicked and he'd taken it to prevent anyone else from getting to it first. And then he hadn't known what to do with it, and he'd spent 4 days in a motel outside Laramie being afraid. What was on it was 37 seconds of footage. It showed Pruitt's cruiser following Rachel's Civic from the Pine Valley Medical Center parking lot. It showed him following her through 2 turns. It showed him reach for his radio, not his radio, his personal phone, and make a call before he activated his lights. A call that lasted 48 seconds, after which he activated his lights and pulled her over. The phone records, when Voss's team pulled them an hour later, showed that call had been made to Roland Hicks's personal cell phone. Pruitt had called his captain for clearance before he stopped her. He'd been ordered to make the stop before he made it. Rachel sat in a chair in the federal building corridor and looked at the transcript Voss had printed for her, and she read those 48 seconds, the duration of the call, the timestamp, the location. And she felt something settle in her chest like a piece of structure clicking into place. Not satisfaction. Something more fundamental than that. The thing that happens when what you know to be true has been confirmed in terms that the world will have to acknowledge. The motion to dismiss your charges, Perry said, appearing beside her with his own copy of the transcript. We file it tonight. This goes directly to Tanaka with the dashcam footage, the phone records, and the cooperation agreement. Your charges are done. Tonight. Tonight. He sat down next to her. He looked tired in a human way, the kind of tired that made him look his actual age. Rachel, I want you to know, when you told me you didn't survive combat to surrender to corruption, I didn't entirely know what I was dealing with. He paused. I know now. She looked at the transcript. 48 seconds. The distance between a man making a phone call and her sitting in gravel with blood on her face was exactly 48 seconds, and the decision of one police captain who was now signing cooperation agreements in a federal interview room. "File the motion," she said. The motion hit Tanaka's desk at 7:14 p.m. At 8:50 p.m., his clerk called Perry's cell to advise that the judge had reviewed the materials and that a ruling on the motion to dismiss would be issued in the morning. Rachel was home by 9. She ate something she didn't taste and sat at the kitchen table with the notebooks and didn't write anything in them, just sat with them. Then she taped the 2 cracked ribs more firmly than the urgent care clinic had and lay on her bed and looked at the ceiling, and somewhere around 10:30, she fell asleep with the lamp still on. At 6 a.m., Perry called. "Tanaka dismissed," he said. She could hear in his voice that he'd been awake since before the call. "All charges. Dropped in their entirety." His ruling cites the dashcam footage, the phone record, the pattern of similar incidents, and what he described as, and I'm reading directly here, a comprehensive failure of law enforcement integrity that rendered the original arrest fundamentally unlawful. She sat up. Her ribs reminded her to do it slowly. Outside the window, early morning, gray-blue, the same color sky it had been the morning Pruitt had pulled her over. "Okay," she said. "Okay." Perry made a sound, half laugh, half exhale. "Rachel, it's over." "It's not over," she said, not unkindly. "The charges are dismissed, that's one piece. Pruitt is still awaiting trial. Hicks is cooperating but hasn't been sentenced. Price is still filing motions. The 14 victims on the full list still need to have their records cleared." She stood up carefully. "It's not over, but the part that was mine, yeah, that part's done." She was quiet for a moment. "Thank you, Perry," she said, "for staying in it." A pause on his end. "You made it pretty impossible to leave," he said. "I'll send you the formal documentation when it's filed." She put the phone down and stood in her bedroom in the early morning light. The charging document with her name on it no longer existed in the legal sense. Everything else still did. She went to the kitchen and made coffee and picked up her notebook and turned to the first page, where she'd written the 12 names, now 14, and she looked at them, and she thought about what it meant that all of this had started because she'd stayed 2 extra hours on a shift and done her job and documented what she saw in a 16-year-old boy's chart. Her phone buzzed again. Not Perry this time. A number she recognized now. Voss. "We have a problem," Voss said, in the tone that meant the problem was real and immediate. "What kind?" "Warren Price." A pause. "He surrendered to federal authorities at 6 a.m. this morning. Came in voluntarily, same as Hicks." Another pause. "But Rachel, before he came in, he gave a statement to 2 local television stations. Cameras, prepared remarks, the whole production." Rachel set down her coffee cup. "What did he say?" "He's claiming," Voss said carefully, "that he was the victim, that Roland Hicks extorted him for 11 years, that the payments were made under duress, that Hicks ran a protection racket and Price was a businessman who had no choice." A pause. "He named you specifically. He said you were part of a coordinated effort to destroy an innocent man's reputation. He said it on camera with a prepared statement to 2 television stations at 5:45 in the morning before anyone could respond." The morning light through Rachel's kitchen window was the flat, bright kind that comes before the sun fully clears the mountains. She picked up her coffee cup again. She thought about 14 names in a notebook, about Darlene Marsh's steady, tired voice on the phone, about Marcus Price and his socks on a porch in the cold, about 48 seconds on a phone call that had set everything in motion. She thought about Warren Price standing in front of television cameras at dawn, reading from a prepared statement, and what it meant that he'd chosen to do that before walking into federal custody. He wasn't trying to escape prosecution. He was trying to control the narrative. And he'd done it before Rachel or Brooks or Voss or anyone else had been awake to respond. "Where are the statements airing?" she asked. "Cedar Ridge Channel 4 and the state affiliate," Voss said. "They'll be on the 6 a.m. broadcast in..." A pause. 12 minutes. Rachel looked at her kitchen table, the notebooks, the legal pad, the motion to dismiss that Perry had filed and Tanaka had granted. All of it real, all of it documented, all of it part of a record that existed in courtrooms and federal filing systems and would eventually be publicly accessible. And on the other side of the scale, a man with money and cameras and a prepared statement and 12 minutes of lead time. She thought about what happened to the truth when it was late to a story that someone else had already told. "Voss," she said, "who has access to the dashcam footage?" A pause. "It's federal evidence. It's not public." "The Farrow interview? The phone records? Hicks's cooperation agreement? Any of it public yet?" "Not yet." "Standard timeline for federal case materials. So right now," Rachel said, "on every television in Cedar Ridge that's tuned to Channel 4, Warren Price is speaking and nobody is contradicting him." Silence. "Yes," Voss said. Rachel looked at her coffee. She looked at the notebooks. "I need to make a call," she said. And then, "Do you have a press contact, someone at the federal level who can issue a statement by 6 a.m.? "I can make that happen, but it takes—" "Make it happen," Rachel said. "Because in 11 minutes, the only version of this story that Cedar Ridge is going to hear is his." She hung up and stood in the kitchen and thought about what it meant to win every legal battle and still lose the morning, and what options a person had when the person they were fighting had more resources and fewer constraints and had made the first move. She thought about 14 people who had pleaded guilty to things they hadn't done because the system had been tilted against them, and what it meant for them to turn on their televisions this morning and hear Warren Price describe himself as the victim. She picked up her phone. She did not call Brooks. She did not call Perry. She called Darlene Marsh. It rang 4 times. "Ms. Foster?" Darlene's voice, already awake. The voice of someone who had been getting up early long enough that sleeping late wasn't something her body remembered how to do. "Darlene," Rachel said, "turn on Channel 4, watch for 2 minutes, and then call every other person on the list you know and tell them to watch. And then call me back." A pause. "Why?" Darlene asked. Rachel looked out the window at the morning sky over Cedar Ridge. "Because we're going to need to decide," she said, "what to say. And we're going to need to say it together. And we need to understand what we're responding to before we respond." A silence. "Okay," Darlene said. The steadiness in her voice was the specific kind that comes from a person who has been patient for a long time and is now done being patient. "Okay, I'll watch." Rachel stood in her kitchen with the phone in her hand and her ribs aching and her coffee going cold in 7 minutes until a man who had paid police officers to destroy innocent lives would appear on every television in Cedar Ridge, describing himself as a victim. And she thought about what the truth was worth if you couldn't get it in front of people fast enough for it to matter. And then her phone buzzed with a text from a number she didn't recognize. Not Cedar Ridge, not Wyoming, a 202 area code. And the message was 4 words and a screenshot of a document header. The 4 words were, "Check your email now." The document header in the screenshot read, "Office of the United States Attorney, District of Wyoming. Official statement for immediate release. Dated this morning. Time-stamped 6 minutes ago." Rachel opened her email. The email was 3 paragraphs. She read it standing in her kitchen in the early morning light with her coffee going cold on the counter and her cracked ribs pressing against the tape and her phone screen the brightest thing in the room. 3 paragraphs, clean federal language, no flourish, but the facts inside it were not small. The U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Wyoming formally confirmed an active federal investigation into Cedar Ridge Police Department officers Dale Pruitt, Roland Hicks, and associated personnel. It confirmed the arrest of Kevin Sorrell, contractor with Meridian Protective Services, on charges including conspiracy and obstruction. It confirmed the voluntary cooperation of Captain Roland Hicks and the evidentiary basis of that cooperation. And it stated directly, in the second paragraph, that all criminal charges against Rachel M. Foster had been dismissed in their entirety following review of dashcam footage and phone records demonstrating that her arrest had been ordered in advance by department leadership with the explicit intent of suppressing a mandatory child welfare report. It named Marcus Price. It named the report. It named what the report had documented. The third paragraph addressed Warren Price by name and described his surrender to federal authorities and the pending charges against him, including conspiracy, obstruction of justice, financial fraud, and complicity in the systematic abuse of law enforcement authority spanning 11 years. At the bottom, a line she read twice. The United States Attorney's Office will make no further public comment until arraignment. All individuals named are presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. Standard language. But the facts above it were not standard. The facts above it were the architecture of Warren Price's version of events collapsing before it had fully aired on Channel 4. She called Voss. "You saw it?" Rachel asked. "We sent it," Voss said. "The U.S. attorney signed off at 5:50 a.m. It went to every major news outlet in the state simultaneously." A pause. Price's people had 3 minutes of exclusive airtime before the statement hit every newsroom in Wyoming. That's 3 minutes they don't get back. Rachel set her phone on the counter. She picked up her coffee, still warm enough. She thought about what it felt like to have spent 11 days being the person the story was told about, rather than a person who had any ability to shape the telling. And now she thought about 3 minutes. 3 minutes that Price had bought with preparation and money and a camera crew he'd arranged before he walked into federal custody, and how 3 minutes was the entire margin by which he'd tried to own a narrative he'd already lost in every other arena. 3 minutes against 11 years. She drank her coffee and called Darlene Marsh back. The arraignment for Dale Pruitt happened on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the parking garage. The federal courthouse in Cheyenne was larger and less personal than Tanaka's county courtroom, and the gallery was half full with people who had driven from Cedar Ridge and surrounding towns for reasons that varied: curiosity, press credentials, and in the case of 14 people sitting together in the third and fourth rows on the left side, something more specific than either of those. Rachel sat at the end of the third row. She'd worn the same dark jacket she'd worn to every federal meeting, because she didn't own many formal clothes, and she wasn't going to buy new ones for this. Her ribs were healing. The bruise on her cheek had faded to yellow-green at the edges, still visible if you knew where to look. Pruitt came in through the side door in a suit that someone had brought him, which was a strange thing to notice, but she noticed it. The suit was slightly too big in the shoulders, the kind of thing that happens when someone else does your shopping while you're in custody and doesn't get the size quite right. He looked smaller than he had in the parking lot. Not in a satisfying way, just smaller. He pleaded not guilty on all counts, which was expected. His lawyer entered the plea briskly, and the judge set a trial date, and the whole proceeding took 11 minutes, and then Pruitt was walked back through the side door, and the gallery exhaled in a specific collective way that wasn't quite sound. Darlene Marsh was sitting 2 seats to Rachel's left. She had her hands folded in her lap, and she watched Pruitt exit through the side door, and then she looked at the floor for a moment, and then she looked at Rachel. "Is that it?" she said quietly. "For today," Rachel said. Darlene nodded slowly. "I spent 3 years thinking I'd done something wrong," she said. "Not that he'd done something wrong, that I'd been loud or difficult, or that I'd provoked it somehow." She looked at the side door, now closed. 3 years carrying that. Rachel didn't have a clean thing to say to that. There wasn't one. So she said, "I know." "Does it go away?" Darlene asked. Rachel thought about it honestly, the way the question deserved. "The carrying part goes away," she said. "The memory of carrying it doesn't. But they're different weights." Darlene looked at her for a moment, then nodded again, slowly, like she was filing that somewhere for later. Roland Hicks was sentenced 8 weeks after his cooperation agreement was formalized. He stood before a federal judge in a courtroom that was quieter than Pruitt's arraignment had been, with his lawyer beside him and his wife conspicuously absent from the gallery, and he received 14 years on consolidated federal charges. The judge, a woman named Hartley, who had spent 22 years on the federal bench and showed it in the precise economy of everything she said, noted in her sentencing remarks that the duration reflected both the severity of the crimes and the length of time over which they had been systematically concealed. Hicks didn't look at the gallery when the sentence was read. He looked at the table in front of him. His lawyer put a hand briefly on his arm, and he didn't acknowledge it. Rachel was not in the courtroom for Hicks's sentencing. She was at Pine Valley Medical Center, in the emergency department, doing a 12-hour shift. She found out from Perry via text during her lunch break. A single message that read, Hicks, 14 years, federal, followed by a period, because Perry used periods at the end of texts the same way he used them everywhere else. She read it in the break room with her sandwich and her cold coffee, and she sat with it for the length of time it took to finish both, and then she went back to the floor. Her reinstatement at Pine Valley had not been smooth. That was the honest version. Director Marcia Dunlop had approved the reinstatement within 48 hours of the charges being dismissed, and the letter she wrote had been professionally warm and appropriately apologetic in the corporate sense. But the first 2 weeks back had an awkward texture. Colleagues who'd said the wrong things during the 11 days and didn't know how to address that, patients who recognized her name from the news and treated her differently in either direction, one senior physician who avoided her entirely for reasons she didn't bother pursuing. She didn't need it to be smooth. She needed it to be functional. It was functional. The work was what it had always been, loud and fast and occasionally terrible, and occasionally the opposite of terrible. People at their worst and most frightened needing someone to be steady, and she was steady. That hadn't changed. That was probably the one thing in the past 2 months that had remained exactly what it was before any of this started. Warren Price went to trial 4 months later. It was the longest proceeding Rachel had been involved with, though she was involved with it primarily as a witness rather than a subject, which was a different experience entirely. She testified for 2.5 hours across 2 sessions. She was precise. She described what she had documented in Marcus Price's chart and why, and she walked through the clinical basis for her mandatory report, and she answered every question from the prosecution in the same steady third-party voice she used for everything. And when Price's defense attorney cross-examined her, she answered those questions the same way. The defense attorney, a man named Colville, who was expensive in a visible way, tried 3 different angles. He tried to suggest her documentation was subjective. She cited specific clinical indicators and their diagnostic criteria, which she had memorized from the relevant literature before she ever set foot in the courtroom because she'd known this was coming. He tried to suggest she had a personal motivation for filing the report. She explained mandatory reporting law, which removed personal motivation from the equation entirely. He tried to suggest her military background indicated a propensity for aggression and poor judgment under pressure. She looked at him steadily. My military background, she said, is the reason I knew how to stay calm in a parking lot when a police officer shoved me into a car mirror. It is also the reason I knew how to complete accurate medical documentation under a great deal of subsequent professional and legal pressure. If the defense would like to argue that either of those things damaged this case, I'm interested to hear how. Colville moved on. The jury deliberated for 2 days and 4 hours. Guilty on 11 counts. Conspiracy, obstruction of a child welfare investigation, financial fraud, witness intimidation, abuse of public trust through corruption of law enforcement, and 4 counts directly related to the systematic harassment of the 14 individuals on the full list that had grown, over the course of the investigation, to 19. 19 people. Not 12, not 14. 19, because once the investigation had gone fully public and the pattern had been formally established, people who hadn't known they had a case had called the federal tip line. Rachel heard the verdict from Perry, who called her from the courthouse steps with what she recognized, in the background, as the sound of Darlene Marsh saying something that wasn't words so much as a sound a person makes when 4 years of weight lifts from their chest without warning. 11 counts, Perry said, all guilty. She was in her car in the Pine Valley parking lot, 20 minutes into her lunch break. The sentencing? She asked. 3 months out, minimum. Hartley's docket. He paused. It's going to be significant, Rachel. The scope of the counts, the financial amounts, the number of victims, the duration. His lawyers will argue mitigation, but the room they have to work with is very small. She thought about Warren Price in a courtroom being read 11 guilty verdicts. She thought about what his face would have looked like, and whether the finish in his voice, that Cedar Ridge money smoothness, would have held or broken, and she found she didn't actually need to know. The verdict was the fact. What his face did was just a face. Okay, she said. Thank you, Perry. Don't thank me, he said. I rode your coattail. You built the architecture of this thing before I even understood what I was looking at. She almost smiled. Send me the billing statement. Rachel, send me the statement, she said. You worked. You should be paid. Price was sentenced on a Wednesday in November. 22 years, federal. Judge Hartley cited the deliberate and sustained nature of the operation, the specific targeting of vulnerable individuals, the use of public institutions as instruments of private harm, and the complete absence of any expression of accountability from the defendant. She used the phrase fundamental betrayal of civic trust, and she used it precisely, the way she used everything, without drama, which made it land harder than it would have with drama. His properties were seized. The Ridgemont Holdings, the ranch outside Cedar Ridge, 2 commercial buildings downtown that had been acquired in the same years the victim pattern started. His personal accounts were frozen pending the financial recovery process, and while the money he'd moved through the Casper account was only partially recovered, $300,000 of $400, the rest lost in international transfer, the assets seized from the property portfolio exceeded the total amounts by a significant multiple. Every victim's record was formally cleared through a federal court order. All 14 original cases, all 19 total, every fine, every charge, every piece of paper, and every county file with their names on it from the Pruitt era, vacated, expunged, removed from record. Darlene Marsh's $280 fine was refunded. Not by the city, initially. The city had to be pushed, and Perry pushed it. But it came back with interest and a formal letter of apology from the Cedar Ridge mayor that Darlene told Rachel she'd read once and then put in a drawer. "Doesn't undo 3 years," Darlene said. "No," Rachel agreed. "But the 280 is nice," Darlene added, and her voice did something that was almost a laugh, the specific sound of someone who has reached the point where the absurdity of a thing is accessible alongside the pain of it. Dale Pruitt went to trial 6 months after his arraignment. He did not plead out. His lawyer had advised him not to, which in Rachel's assessment was either very brave or very poor counsel. He was convicted on 9 counts, including the assault charges that represented what he had done to Rachel in that parking lot, plus the pattern charges that covered the broader 14 years of conduct. He was sentenced to 19 years. He didn't say anything when the sentence was read. His lawyer did the appropriate procedural things. Pruitt sat with his hands flat on the table and looked straight ahead and said nothing. Rachel watched him from the gallery. She had thought sometimes about what this moment would feel like. She'd been honest with herself about that somewhere underneath the work and the documentation and the strategic thinking, there was a person who had knelt in gravel with her hands zip-tied and her cheek bleeding and a man standing over her with a smile, and that person had feelings about consequence. She hadn't pretended otherwise. What she felt, watching Pruitt sit in silence while a judge assigned a number of years to what he'd done, was quieter than she'd expected. Not nothing, but quieter. Less like a door slamming and more like a door finally, after a long time, closing at the right position. She walked out of the courtroom into a November afternoon in Wyoming, cold and bright. The mountains visible from the courthouse steps in the specific way they were visible on clear days. Close-seeming, present, the kind of landscape that doesn't care what happens in the buildings at its edge and is better for not caring. Major Brooks was standing on the steps. She hadn't known he'd be there. She stopped. He looked the same as he always had. Civilian clothes, the weathered face, the posture that came with itself regardless of what he was wearing. He had his hands in his jacket pockets, and he was squinting slightly at the light. "Wasn't sure you'd be here," she said. "Wasn't sure either," he said, "but it seemed right." They stood on the steps for a moment without talking, watching the street below. Cedar Ridge, mid-morning, people moving. The ordinary business of a city that had had a very bad year and was in the process of figuring out what it was going to be on the other side of that. "Army's put together something," he said. "Formal recognition. Your service record. The conduct through this, there's a commendation, if you want it." She looked at the mountains. "I want it," she said. Not immediately, not reflexively. After a moment, because she'd thought about this before, what recognition meant and who it was for, and she'd worked out that accepting recognition wasn't the same as needing it. You could have both be true. "There's also something else," he said. "Proposal. I'm not going to pitch it at you right now because you just watched a sentencing and you're probably tired." "I'm always tired," she said. "Pitch it." He almost smiled, just at the edge. "There's a federal program, Joint Military and Justice Department. designed to provide resources to civilians, veterans, and others who get caught in exactly this kind of situation. Systems designed to protect people failing them. The program needs people who understand both environments. She looked at him. "You're asking if I want to work it," she said. "I'm asking if you'd consider talking about it." She thought about 19 people. She thought about Darlene Marsh's $280 and 3 years. She thought about a drawer in Darlene's house with a mayoral apology letter in it that was real, but not enough. She thought about other cities, other towns, other people with the same architecture of quiet destruction built around them by people who understood that the easiest target was a person who didn't expect to be one. "I'll consider it," she said, "after my shift tonight." "You're working tonight?" 12 to 8, she said. "Highway season. We're short in the ER." He looked at her for a moment. "You're going back to work tonight," he said. Not a judgment, just a thing he was looking at and finding consistent with everything else. "I'm a nurse," she said. "That's not a secondary thing. That's what I am." "I know." He nodded. "That's why the proposal makes sense." She started down the courthouse steps. Her ribs were healed, had been for 6 weeks. She moved normally now, without the internal accounting of injury that had become background noise for so long she'd almost forgotten it was there. At the bottom of the steps she stopped. She looked back at the building, at the doors she'd just come through, at the steps, at the street that ran past it in both directions. She thought about the corner of Birch and Mallow, where the lights had appeared in her rearview mirror. She thought about the morning she'd spent in a holding cell in Scrubs with a bleach stain on the knee. She thought about sitting on a concrete parking garage floor while federal agents moved around her, and Brooks handing her tape for her lip, and the specific word he'd used, sergeant, that had landed differently than she'd expected. She thought about what it meant that a man like Pruitt had looked at her and seen something dismissible. She'd spent a long time being angry about what that look had cost her. She'd spent considerably less time being clear-eyed about what it had revealed. Not about her, but about every person on those 19 lines in her notebook who had sat across from the same look and not had 8 years of specialized training to fall back on, who had been dismissed and had no visible framework to stand inside. That was the thing that sat with her now. Not the vindication. The vindication was real, and she wasn't going to pretend it wasn't. But the thing that sat with her most persistently was the question of what happened to the people who faced the same machine without the same tools. The people who didn't know how to break zip ties, who didn't have a service record that triggered automatic flags when someone accessed it without authorization, who didn't have the specific stubborn architecture of a person trained to function under sustained threat. They pleaded down. They paid the fine. They carried it for 3 years, or 7, or more. And the machine kept running because nobody with the right access and the right knowledge had stayed in the room long enough to find the seams. She turned back toward the street. She walked to her car and she drove to her apartment and she changed into her scrubs. And she ate something while standing at the kitchen counter because she'd learned years ago that sitting down to eat before a long shift was a commitment she rarely honored. She looked at her kitchen table, which no longer had the notebooks on it. They were filed, organized, handed to Perry, and then to the federal prosecutors in carefully labeled order. The table was just a table now. She drove to Pine Valley Medical Center. She badged in through the staff entrance and took the corridor to the ER and signed in at the board. And the charge nurse, a man named Dell, who had been running the night shift for as long as anyone could remember, handed her the first chart without ceremony. 43-year-old, possible cardiac event, Bay 2, he said. Vitals are stable, but she's scared. Okay, Rachel said. She pushed through the curtain into Bay 2, and the woman inside, 43, probably younger looking on a day when she wasn't terrified, looked up at her with the specific kind of fear that makes people's eyes go very wide and very still. And Rachel pulled her stool close to the bed and sat down at eye level because she'd learned years ago that the angle at which you talk to someone in a hospital bed matters more than most people realize. Hey, Rachel said. Tell me what happened. The woman told her. Rachel listened. She asked the right questions in the right order, not because they were the right questions in a procedural sense, though they were, but because they were the questions that would give her the clearest picture of what this woman's body was doing and what it needed, and that was the job. And the job was what it had always been. The same work it had been before the lights had appeared in her rearview mirror, before gravel and zip ties and 14 names in a notebook. The work didn't change. That was the thing about it. The world had tried to take it from her and failed, and she'd gotten it back, and it was exactly what it had been. No cleaner, no easier, just real. Somewhere across the city, in a federal detention facility, Dale Pruitt was learning what a number of years felt like when it wasn't abstract. Warren Price was doing the same. Roland Hicks had been doing it for 4 months. Somewhere in Cedar Ridge, 19 people had clean records, and Darlene Marsh had her $280. Somewhere northeast of the city, in a direction Rachel would always know by heart now, a 16-year-old named Marcus Price was living with his mother in a house that his father could no longer control, learning what it felt like to be in a space where the threat level was not constant. She knew because Voss had told her, and because Diane Price had sent her a letter, not an email, a letter, handwritten, 2 pages, that Rachel had read once and then folded carefully and put somewhere she would keep it. She focused on the woman in Bay 2. She ordered the right tests. She explained what she was looking for and why, in language that reduced rather than amplified the fear in the woman's eyes, because that too was the job. Not just the clinical part, but the human part underneath it that made the clinical part mean something. 2 hours into her shift, during a brief lull, she stepped outside to the ambulance bay and stood in the cold November air for a few minutes. The sky over Cedar Ridge was clear and dark and large the way Wyoming skies are large, the specific vast dark that makes you feel simultaneously very small and very real. She thought about what Brooks had described, a federal program, both environments, the people who fell into the gap between systems and the people who knew how to find them. She thought about what she was. She was a nurse. That was true, and it was load-bearing, and she wasn't giving it up. But she was also someone who had spent 8 years learning how systems failed people and 3 years learning how civilian systems failed people in a different way. And she had spent the past several months doing something she hadn't had a name for at the time, pulling a thread and following it, and refusing to let go until the full shape of the thing was visible. She wasn't going to pretend that had been easy. She wasn't going to sand off the edges of what it had cost. The night sitting at the kitchen table with the cold coffee and the notebooks and the specific sick weight of understanding how many people had been hurt. The morning in the parking garage. The cracked ribs she'd ignored for too long because stopping had felt impossible. The hearing she'd nearly walked into without enough evidence, and how close the margin had been. None of that was clean. None of it was the way it should have gone. She'd had tools other people didn't have, and she'd still barely held the line on several occasions, which meant that people without her tools, and there were so many of them, weren't holding the line at all. That was the thing she was going to do something about. Not instead of nursing. Not by becoming someone she wasn't, but as herself, with everything she carried, in whatever form the work took. She went back inside. She had 8 more hours, a full board, and somewhere in the city there were people who were going to need the specific thing she was good at. Not the military part, not the legal part, but the oldest part. The part that walked into a room where someone was afraid and sat down at eye level and said, "Tell me what happened." She pushed back through the doors into the light, and the noise, and the work. The corner of Birch and Mallow was 4 blocks east. She didn't think about it. She was already somewhere else, already moving toward the next thing, which was the only direction that had ever made sense to her. They had looked at her and seen someone dismissible. They had been wrong about so many things, but they had been most wrong about that.